And I guess going back to the thing we were discussing before, the essence of the Australian government position at the moment, although the Australian government wouldn't exactly put it this way, is that we do think that China's challenge to America's leadership, it's so important that that challenge be defeated that if necessary, we should be willing to go to war with China in order to prevent it. Now that is, I think, fantastically dangerous for several reasons. One is I don't think that's a war that the West can win. I don't think it's a war that America can win. And attempting to fight it would actually destroy the very thing that it was trying to preserve. I also think it's very likely that that war would become a nuclear war.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking to Professor Hugh White, an emeritus professor of strategic studies at the Australian National University. Professor White has researched and published for decades on Australia's strategic and defense policy, Asia-Pacific security issues, and global strategic affairs. Among other positions, he has served as an intelligence analyst with the Office of National Assessments and as a senior official in the Department of Defense. Today, we want to discuss Australia's strategic situation and the hard choices ahead. Professor White, welcome.
Very nice to be with you. Thank you for the invitation.
Very glad to have you, because you're one of the people who's been working on Australian grand strategy for many years. And maybe my first question, what keeps the Australian security community currently awake at night? What are the country's greatest geopolitical worries?
Oh, I think that's an easy question to answer now, easier now than it's been for many decades. We in Australia do see that China's growing power and ambition threatens the US leadership in strategic affairs in Asia, which we have seen as what you could say the necessary and sufficient condition for our security ever since the Second World War. And indeed, you could say more profoundly than that, ever since European settlement of the Australian continent in 1778. Australians have always regarded the domination of the Western Pacific by either Britain first and then America after Britain's decline as the kind of, as I say, necessary and sufficient condition for our security, as long as this region was dominated by an Anglo-Saxon power, English-speaking power with whom we felt very strong affinities of language and culture and values and so on, then we always felt that, in the end, we'd be pretty secure. And, the fact is that China poses the greatest challenge to that there has been since European settlement, because China has become by far and away, relatively speaking, in global terms, the most powerful Asian power since the beginning of the 19th century, really, since China lost its place as the world's biggest economy to Britain, as Britain powered ahead with the Industrial Revolution. And of course, the only other challenge that's been in all of those centuries has been the challenge from Imperial Japan. And that was, of course, very serious while it lasted, but Imperial Japan was, relatively speaking, a much less formidable challenger than China has proved to be. At its strongest, Imperial Japan ever had an economy that was probably bigger than about the fifth the size of America's in PPP terms. And now, of course, in China, we have a challenger whose economy is as big as America's in PPP terms, maybe bigger. And so that makes China the most formidable challenger that the Anglo-Saxon powers have ever faced in Asia. And that makes that brings us to a position where we in Australia see the fundamentals of our security as facing perhaps the most serious challenge they've ever faced. And I think, to be honest, we don't know what to do about it. And so, the short answer to your question is, what keeps Australian strategic thinkers awake at night? China.
But is China a real threat in the sense that Australians feel that, oh my God, we are going to be attacked? Or is it a kind of, we've never had this situation challenge of it's just getting used to the US not being the top dog anymore? Are Australians really worried about a Chinese invasion?
Really, really good question. Look, let me separate my answer into two parts. I think in Australia, many Australians, including many quite, people who are so to speak, professionally engaged in the debate rather than just sort of the person in the street, do in a muzzy kind of way fear direct Chinese aggression. I think that's wrong. I don't think China threatens Australia in the sense that Russia threatened Ukraine before February of 2022, or for that matter, the way Russia, I think, clearly threatens the Baltic states today. It requires no feat of the imagination to imagine Russia attacking the Baltic states today. Whereas it requires a real feat of the imagination to imagine China attacking Australia directly. And so my argument is that China, its growing power and ambition, does not threaten Australia directly. What it does do is to threaten its challenge to the US-led order in Asia, threatens the structures, the national order upon which we have relied for our security. And so if China's challenge succeeds, if China takes America's place as the leading power in East Asia and the Western Pacific, then in the longer term, Australia will be more vulnerable to aggression from China, or for that matter, from other countries, than we have been over the long decades, indeed centuries, of Anglo-Saxon domination. So it's what you might call a second-order effect, but quite a significant second-order effect. Australia has always believed that we could not defend ourselves independently, that we had to rely on what one of our former prime ministers called a great and powerful friend to keep us safe in our strange, anomalous position on the margins of Asia. And so even Australians who don't believe that China threatens Australia directly still understand that China's rise and its challenge to the United States, if it succeeds, will constitute a fundamental change in our strategic environment and require us to think about our security in very different ways.
So in a sense, it's less a perception of direct threat, and it's rather a deep-seated insecurity about what's going to come that emanates toward Australia.
Yes, that's exactly right. Now, whether that insecurity is rationally based or not, of course, only history will judge. And much depends on what kind of hegemonic power China turns out to be, if it does indeed succeed in achieving a degree of hegemony in East Asia and the Western Pacific. I think it will, as a matter of fact. So I think we have to take these challenges very seriously. But whether that will materialize as a direct threat to Australia in the more distant future depends on, well, two things. First of all, on what kind of hegemonic power China turns out to be. Now, hegemonic powers come in lots of different varieties. One variety, one might say, at the more congenial, less alarming end of the scale, is the way the United States exercises hegemony in the Western Hemisphere, which has been generally fairly benign. Now, obviously, there have been episodes in which America's Western Hemispheric neighbours haven't felt it to be all that benign. I imagine the people in Cuba wouldn't regard US hegemony as very benign, but generally US hegemony has been pretty benign. Countries in the Western Hemisphere have gone about their business in their own way, often rather erratically, and America has let them get on with it. And if China chooses to take what one might call the sort of Monroe model, Monroe Doctrine model of the kind of hegemonist that it chose to be if it achieves hegemony in East Asia and the Western Pacific, then Australia, particularly because we're quite a long way from China, we could live with that. But if China, the further China moves along the spectrum away from Monroe and the Monroe Doctrine towards Joseph Stalin, and the kind of very radically intrusive hegemony that Stalin imposed on Eastern Europe in the years after 1945, well, that would be a very different proposition. It's also worth bearing in mind that even the most benign hegemons, and again, I'd take America as an example, do use armed force occasionally against countries that don't do what they want. And so I think we'd have to say even the least alarmist of assessments of the kind of Asia that we'll find ourselves living in if China's challenge to US primacy succeeds, even the least alarmist assessment would have to acknowledge, I think, that the risk of Australia facing a direct threat from a major power in not this year or next year, maybe not even this decade or next decade, but, the decades whiz past pretty fast. You've got to think a fair way ahead in this business. that would be higher than we have known it since the rise of Japan. And that's something that Australian policymakers have to take pretty seriously. The other point I'd make is that in the Asia that we're envisaging, an Asia in which China's challenges succeeded, the United States no longer plays the role in Asia that it's played for so long, and so much to Australia's benefit. The potential for challenges for the threats to Australia arises not just from China itself, but from other Asian powers in an Asian order which was no longer framed and made safe for us by American power. And there are two other powers I've mentioned in particular. One is India. It's very common, including in Australia, to see India purely and India's rise to great power status purely as part of the business of balancing China. I think that's a big mistake. I think India is a great power in its own right. It has the ambitions of a great power in its own right. It seeks its own sphere of influence in its own near abroad, in South Asia and the Indian Ocean. Australia, of course, is an Indian Ocean country as well as a Western Pacific country. And I think the most likely trajectory for Asia is for Australia rather, is for us to find ourselves sitting on the boundary between a Chinese sphere of influence and an Indian sphere of influence. And we should be worried, I think, not because India threatens Australia right now, not at all, but that in a future Asia in which India is as much a great power as China and conducts itself with all of the assertiveness that great powers traditionally do, we'll end up having to focus on what the kind of pressure India wants to impose upon us, as well as China. And the third country is Indonesia. People find it very hard to keep a focus on Indonesia, and there are good reasons for that. But the fact is that, in all probability, Indonesia will well before the middle of the century be the fourth biggest economy in the world. It will be a great power in its own right. Whether it'll, or at least it will have the material attributes of great power. Whether it'll behave as a great power, we don't know. It's a bit hard to see the Indonesia that we've grown used to, really ever since the fall of Sukarno in the mid-60s, behaving as a great power. It's under the new order under Suharto, and then in the Reformasi era, since the fall of Suharto in 97, Indonesia has stuck to a pretty unassertive vision of itself as a member of ASEAN more than anything else. But there's no guarantee that continues. And if Indonesia does in future become a more assertive country, then unlike China and India, it's very close to Australia. And so that's another issue for us. Again, I don't think Indonesia threatens Australia at all at the moment, but no prudent framing of Australia's longer-term strategic future can afford to overlook the possibility that unless relations with Indonesia are managed very well, and I might say managed a lot better than they've tended to be in the last few decades, then the risk to Australia that relations with a much more powerful Indonesia would become problematic in future decades is not one we can overlook. So I do think it's legitimate, appropriate, prudent for Australians to recognise that if China's challenge to US primacy in Asia succeeds, if China takes America's place in East Asia and the Western Pacific, if India becomes the primary power and establishes a sphere of influence in South Asia and the Indian Ocean, if Indonesia realizes its destiny and emerges as a great power in its own right, Australia will be living in a very different, much more difficult strategic environment in which it will have to manage its strategic affairs much more alone in the face of much bigger potential threats. And that will be more demanding for our diplomacy to make sure those threats don't emerge, and for our strategy, our military policy, to make sure we can deal with them if they do. And the last point I make, I'm sorry, that was a long answer to your question, but the last point I make is that, one thing that Australians do feel is that we're very alone. It's hard, I think. I often find in conversations with Europeans that Europe has achieved so much in the decades since the Second World War of drawing itself together. And, there's all the, peculiarities of the EU and, of course, Switzerland's special place in that unfolding framework and so on. But still, I think Europeans sometimes find it hard to recognize just how alone a country like Australia can feel, because we do feel our Western roots very deeply, and we do feel a long way from Europe.
May I ask you, do you think that this sense of insecurity is rooted to just this European past? Because if you say Australia feels alone, I mean, Indonesia is right there. Down there, it's like, okay, it's smaller, and you're surrounded by a lot of people, and China has I think you have a good trade relationship with them, right? So what I sense to hear from you is that a lot of this has to do that Australia actually perceives itself as inherently European, inherently part of that colonial enterprise that we believe is over, but actually still dominates our way of thinking. Is that a thing?
Yeah, absolutely. Really, really important points. Because, of course, what you say is absolutely right. The fact is, we might feel alone, but we're not alone. In fact, if you think of, Australia's basic interests align very closely with those of the countries in our closer neighborhood, particularly in Southeast Asia, including Indonesia, but also Singapore, Malaysia, the whole lot. We want the same thing. Everybody is worried about how China, and for that matter, India, are going to use their rising power. Everybody wants to maintain good relations with those two countries. Everyone would, in fact, prefer America to continue to play some kind of role in Asia to help balance China's and I think eventually India's power and, prevent them from getting too hegemonic. None of us want to find ourselves living in a new Cold War in Asia. None of us want to suffer the consequences of having to make a choice between America and China. And so, at one level, you'd think, the natural way for Australia to respond to this predicament that we've been discussing is to draw closer to our neighbours. And when you listen to what Australian political leaders, at least some Australian political leaders, say in their speeches, it sounds like that's what we're doing. Our Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, for example, makes a great play of saying that, Australia is drawing closer and closer to our Southeast Asian neighbours as we deal with the increased fluidity and uncertainty of our strategic neighbourhood, all that kind of language. But the fact is, it's not true. And the reason it's not true is that, in fact, Australia has taken a very distinctively different approach to the issues raised for our long-term security by the US-China strategic competition from what our neighbours have done. Because what Australia has done, notwithstanding what people like Penny Wong have said, is to unambiguously side with the United States in its contest with China, to unambiguously declare that America's objectives are our objectives, and that what we seek is for the US to defeat China's challenge and preserve its position as a leading power in East Asia, just like it's always been in the past. And that's not a view shared by any of our neighbours, except perhaps Japan. Now, Japan's a very interesting special case, it seems to me. And I'm sure you know a lot more about Japan than I do. But if you look at all the others, if you look at all of the Southeast Asians, and I might say also, from my perspective, I don't regard myself as an expert on this, but from my perspective, South Korea as well, all of them, as I touched on a second ago, would like the United States to stay engaged in Asia to balance China. But they don't believe it's possible for the United States to preserve the old role it used to play in Asia. And they're not prepared to commit themselves to support the United States in pursuing the United States objectives in the strategic contest with China. Whereas that's precisely what Australia has done. And one of the most significant things about the AUKUS agreement is that it's become a very potent symbol of that commitment. And that's the way it's seen, certainly the way it's seen in Washington. I think it's also the way it's seen in Canberra. If there was any doubt before AUKUS that Australia has committed itself absolutely to supporting the United States in the United States approach to the challenge from China. Then AUKUS removed it. And my reservation about that is that I don't think the US approach to China is going to work. I do not believe the United States can preserve the old US-led order in Asia based on US primacy in the face of a challenge from China when China is the most formidable strategic rival the United States has ever faced. And I therefore think US policy is going to fail, and I therefore think Australian policy is going to fail. And the fact that we've aligned ourselves with what I think is a failing US policy has actually increased the distance between us and our Southeast Asian neighbours at exactly the time when we should be reducing it.
And isn't there another danger as well? I mean, as a strategist and probably also to a good part a realist in IR, aren't you worried that Australia might simply become a pawn in this strategic competition, or like even if it comes to that, to a war? Because one of the things is really interesting when I talk to Southeast Asian colleagues, most of them, especially the ones from Malaysia, they say very strongly, don't lecture us on how to deal with China. We've dealt with them for 2,000 years. We are fine with it. Now, Australia is much younger in that sense, right? Is that like this insecurity of being a 200-year-old nation that just learns how to play the game?
Yeah, well, yes, these are the big questions. Because, of course, one part of all of that is that our neighbours, although they do, as I mentioned before, of course, they prudently reflect on, worry about how China will use its growing power. They'd be unwise not to. But they don't regard it as unthinkable that they should learn to live with a powerful China, learn to manage it. It's going to take a bit of flexibility. They'll have to do a bit of ducking and weaving, but that's what middle powers do in the face of great powers. I mean, this is no news to Europeans. The whole history of the smaller and middle European powers is that they've lived with this patchwork of great powers, and they've learnt that there are certain things you have to do in order to manage those relationships. They've taken different approaches. Switzerland's taken one approach, Belgium took another approach, the Netherlands took another approach, but you can do this. So I think, what strikes me when I talk to my Southeast Asian friends and colleagues is that although they're prudently aware of the risks that accrue to them, they're also just sort of pretty confident that they can make this work. And I think that's partly, to go precisely to the point you raised, it's because, of course, they have a deep historical memory of what it's like to live in a Chinese hemisphere. And that's a very crude way of putting it, but you know what I mean. Whereas for Australians, I think we're having a moment of panic, really. I think that's the right word, that the idea of us living in an Asia which is no longer dominated and made safe for us by the United States is kind of unthinkable for a lot of Australians. And the irony, the peculiarity is that this is happening at a time when, for purely demographic reasons, we are becoming less and less European and more Asian. Australia for many, many decades, and to its eternal shame, adopted a white Australia policy whereby it essentially, rejected immigrants from non-white countries. In the late 60s and early 70s, that policy was abandoned, thank heaven. Since then, we've had massive immigration from a wide range of Asian countries. Our biggest sources of immigrants these days are India and China. And so, there are well over a million, probably I think 1.2 million Australians out of 25 million of Chinese descent, comparable numbers from India. So in fact, and that trend will continue. But we are becoming a more Asian country. And so we should, in a sense, be becoming more comfortable with these things. In fact, as the shock of China's rise and challenge has hit home to us, over the last decade or so, we've become more uncomfortable with the idea of living in an Asia dominated by powerful Asian countries than we were 30 or 40 years ago. If you go back to the 1960s or 1970s, although it wasn't actually happening, it was quite common for Australian political leaders to recognise that in the decades to come, as Asian countries developed, they would become more powerful and we'd end up living in an Asia that was dominated by Asian powers. But now that it's actually happening, we're kind of recoiling from that and panicking about it. I think one reason for that is that the present generation, I speak of someone who's a little bit older than the majority of the present generation, came of age not in the era of Vietnam, but in the post-Cold War decade of the 1990s, when there was, for a time, a kind of very naive optimism about the way in which we were going to live in a world dominated by America for as far ahead as we could see. And so I think, in a sense, the generations that lived through the First and the Second World Wars, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the challenges that America faced, had a more realistic perspective of the scope and limits of American power than the generation that came of age in the heady, optimistic, I think, misguided years of the 1990s.
So do you think this skews the current perception of Australia when it comes to the security issue? Because like one more thing that strikes me is that when I hear these fears, especially of China, is that it always assumes, very much like Mr. Mersheimer does, much like Mersheimer, that China, at the end of the day, will behave just like any European power would.
Yeah.
And once it has power, it will use it, and it will use it militarily, and it will go out on a conquest spree, and it will take whatever it wants, which is a very European thing to do, because this is basically what we did. This is why Australia was settled with the whites, right?
Yeah, that's why we're here. No, that's exactly right. Look, I think there's 2 points to make there, or 2 steps to the process. When I and others started thinking about this issue in the 1990s, when it became clear that China's transformation under Xi Jinping, beginning in the late 70s, when by the late 80s, early 90s, it became clear that that was working and that something big was happening in China. And it did take really until the end of the 80s for that to become really clear. Then and I was working in government, then we started thinking about what that was going to mean in the longer term. And we quite quickly, so to speak, began a debate within Australian strategic circles about what it meant. And there were 2 views. And the first was that as China's power grew, it would seek to challenge the US as the leading power in East Asia and assert its own position as the region's leading power, and try and push the United States out. In other words, the deal that was done between Nixon and Mao in 1972, whereby Nixon recognised the Chinese Communist Party as the government of China, roughly speaking, and the Chinese recognised America, or accepted America as the leading power in East Asia. That deal would be reneged on once China was strong enough to do so. And I argued that was what would happen. And a lot of people argued, no, that wouldn't happen because China is different. That's a European model of what great powers do. And in fact, what we should expect is that China will accept and continue to accept America's leadership in East Asia because it's in China's interest, particularly its economic interest. And I think that turned out to be wrong. I think China is actually behaving very much as Mearsheimer or others would predict, in seeking to challenge US leadership in Asia, in seeking to assert a great power sphere of influence in its own region, the way great powers traditionally do. And I might say the way Japan did in its day, in its imperial time. But that's not to say that a China that ends up as the dominant power, or seeking to become the dominant power in East Asia and the Western Pacific, thereby seeks to do so in what you might call a highly militarized way. It doesn't mean that it's going to behave the way the British did, or the French did, or the Germans did, or the Russians did. In fact, I think as we were touching on before, I think there are a lot of different models of regional hegemony. And my own view has always been that China is unlikely to be a highly militarized hegemonist, partly because of the strategic geography of the region. So much of it's maritime, and that's a very different challenge from the sort of continental challenges that the Europeans faced. Partly because of the distribution of power. This is not like the Europeans erupting into an Africa, or for that matter, in East Asia, which by the time they got there was composed of pretty weak political entities. So, China is by far and away the strongest power in East Asia, but there are countries like, Japan, South Korea, Indonesia. These are pretty robust entities. They're not going to be knocked over. So I've always thought that China was likely to take the first step, that is to seek to overturn US hegemony in the region and take its place. But I never thought it was particularly likely that it was going to do it in a particularly militaristic way. It was going to adopt different kind of approaches. Now, I do think China has a very serious military agenda in relation to Taiwan, but I think Taiwan is a special case, a very special case. But I think otherwise, and this goes back to the point I made before, I don't believe that China threatens Australia militarily, nor do I think it threatens Japan or South Korea or Thailand militarily. It could conceivably, if as its power grows and if it succeeds in establishing a regional hegemony, if it chooses to express that, implement that hegemony in a particularly aggressive way, then that becomes a problem. But I don't think that's the most likely outcome. And one of the reasons why, unlike many people in the Australian debate, I think Australia can and should accept the prospect of a Chinese-led Asia is A, I don't think we can avoid it, but B, I think if we play our cards right, we can manage it pretty well. It doesn't seem to me to be all that hard. So I don't think we in Australia need to be nearly as worried about it as we are. We should take more of the more relaxed approach that our Southeast Asian neighbours take.
I agree with that, because if you look at it, there's also this danger, of course, that we create a self-fulfilling prophecy by the way that we engage China, and by we I now mean the West, right, in general, and I count Japan as part of that, because China, I mean, how many wars did it fight since 1949? It fought a war with Vietnam, a very brief one. And it has some border disputes also with India, but they are managing that. It has border disputes with Bhutan, but it didn't try to overrun Bhutan. Bhutan is actually trying to engage China recently, creatively. And it has disputes with the Philippines. It has a very, very special issue with Taipei and Beijing, but that's basically
that's a special case,
China civil war case, right? But in this sense, if you look at it from the Chinese perspective of then hearing American and Western strategists talking about the first island chain and the need to contain China and, putting all of its guns and directing them at China, that would make me feel worried, and then automatically create this spiral of, okay, we need a bigger military in order to defend ourselves, which then sets off this goddamn security dilemma.
Yeah, no, look, I think there's a lot of truth in that. One of the elements of the argument, the debate that we had in Australia beginning in the 90s about how far China would go towards trying to contest US primacy in the Western Pacific was whether the Chinese would see it in their interests to do so. And as I mentioned before, one of the arguments was put on the other side of the debate from mine, the side that said China would accept American primacy and therefore there was no problem for Australia. One of the arguments that was put was that China would have no reason to fear that its interests were threatened by American primacy in Asia. And I said, well, that depends how America behaves. Because if America chooses to take fright at China's economic rise and to try and constrain it, then that will give the Chinese very good reasons to try and keep them, trying to push America out and keep it at arm's length. And of course, that's exactly what's happened. And so I think you're right. There has been a classic, action-reaction dynamic set up, whereby the more the United States has taken fright at China's rise, the bigger steps it's taken to contain China, and I think that is the right verb to use, the stronger China's incentives to push America out of the region. I think that's exactly what's going on. Now, as I say, I I think my own view is that there's always been a strong chance that China would anyway have sought to overturn US primacy in Asia, to take America's place as a leading power in East Asia, because America's presence in the region has always been, if I can put it this way, very intrusive. And it always seemed to me that it would be very unnatural and improbable that China would continue to accept what America sees as a subordinate position to America at a time when China's economy had overtaken America's. And I think, partly this is a matter of national identity and national pride and so on. The Chinese experience and the Chinese achievement in recent decades is truly remarkable. The resentments, albeit perhaps partly manufactured by the way in which the history has been told, but the resentments about the century of humiliation are very real. The sense that China has been mistreated and that it needs to stand up. The rejuvenation of the Chinese people, these are real sentiments. So I think it always seemed to be anyway that that would be very unwise for us in the West and elsewhere in Asia to presume that China would continue to accept American primacy once it no longer had to. And indeed, that's proven not to be the case. But I think it's a mistake to go from that to saying that the Chinese taking America's place is such a threat to our interests that we should be prepared to go to any lengths, including going to war with China, in order to prevent it. And I guess going back to the thing we were discussing before, the essence of the Australian government position at the moment, although the Australian government wouldn't exactly put it this way, is that we do think that China's challenge to America's leadership, it's so important that that challenge be defeated that if necessary, we should be willing to go to war with China in order to prevent it. Now, that is, I think, fantastically dangerous for several reasons. One is I don't think that's a war that the West can win. I don't think it's a war that America can win. And attempting to fight it would actually destroy the very thing that it was trying to preserve. I also think it's very likely that that war would become a nuclear war, which would be catastrophic in every sense. It's a bit of a revelation to someone who is going to turn 72 this year that one has to remind people that avoiding nuclear war is a really, really, really high order imperative in the management of international affairs. A lot of the bold talk about how America is going to deter China overlooks the fact that China is a nuclear power with the capacity to put nuclear weapons on American cities. And if you don't bear that in mind, then you're missing all the fundamentals.
We have a really, really big problem at the moment, which is that in Western discourse, Europe, the US, and apparently also in Australia, fear of nuclear weapons seems to be gone, which invalidates the MAD doctrine, which kind of collapses the entire idea of nuclear peace. It's absolutely dumb and ridiculous, but that's where we are.
Absolutely. It's one of the most striking things about the Ukraine crisis. You've all these otherwise sensible people mocking the US administration for having been very careful to avoid the risk of nuclear escalation over Ukraine. I tell you, anyone who goes out of their way to avoid nuclear escalation has got my vote. That's what you need to do. And so the fact that people in Washington, and for that matter in Australia and in Europe, could talk about the need to deter China from attacking Taiwan or whatever, without recognizing that they're talking about threatening to fight a war with an adversary, with a nuclear armed adversary. It seems to me to be astonishingly irresponsible. And of course, AUKUS draws Australia even more explicitly into that. The whole point about AUKUS from America's point of view, of course, and US officials have been very explicit about this. It's all about guaranteeing that if there's a war between America and China, then Australia will fight alongside the United States. Now, Australian political leaders say, no, we haven't made any commitments. But frankly, I don't believe them, because I don't believe the United States would be even contemplating passing us between 3 and 5 Virginia-class submarines if they weren't absolutely sure that those submarines would be available to the United States in the event of a war with China. It makes no sense. It makes no sense at all. And so I think there's a real, the real danger I see in the policy that Australia has adopted of supporting America's position vis-a-vis China so unambiguously, is that Australia supporting America encourages America to take an approach to China which is not going to work and which brings, I think, a very real risk of a US-China war, which in turn has a very real risk of becoming a nuclear war, which would be an unimaginable disaster.
Yeah, and again, fight parts of the war with China through proxies, including Australia, right?
Yes, that's exactly right. And there's been a little bit of that already, a few years ago, from 2020 through to about 2023. China imposed some relatively harsh economic constraints on Australian trade with China, and it's important to mention here, which we haven't touched on, is that one of the dynamics in this situation is that China is by far and away Australia's biggest trading partner, and particularly by far and away our biggest export market. It is the only country that has ever been as important to Australia as an export market in our entire history has been Britain during the imperial days when we were very much part of the imperial economy. Every day, Australia exports to China 2 million tonnes of iron ore. Every day. It's
2 million tonnes?
2 million tonnes a day.
Of what? Of
iron ore.
Iron ore.
Iron ore. 2 million tonnes a day. It's a huge trade. And it keeps the lights on in Australia. And it's not just iron ore. A lot of other things as well, but iron ore is the big one. We provide the iron ore that's built Chinese cities. And cities are mostly built out of steel and concrete. And
this is like the history of trade is the history of interdependence, right?
Yes, right. You got it. Yes, that's right.
Let me ask you though, sorry to switch a little bit, but I wonder about the political consensus within the country. Like the current government has embarked on this or is on this track. Yeah. What is the internal cohesion here? Are all the major parties on board with this strategy, or are there major political forces that say like, no, we need to change the approach?
No, very important point. There is absolute consensus behind the support for the United States on both sides of politics. We run an essentially two-party system. And at the moment, the more left-leaning party is in power, broadly social democrat kind of party. And it is as strongly committed to supporting the United States as the more conservative party has been. And the result is there is no effective political level debate about these issues, and nor is there very much debate outside the political level in the media and so on. There's a very strong consensus that supporting the United States is the only thing we can possibly do. A commonly used line is that Australia's made its choice to support the United States. We made that choice decades ago. You could say in 1941, the time of Pearl Harbor, and that there's nothing else we can do. Now, I think that's a very, very fundamental mistake. And that's my principal, so to speak, contribution to the debate for many years now has been to argue that we do have more choices than that, and that we should not be supporting the United States in a policy which is not going to work, and that indeed our support for the United States makes that policy more dangerous because it encourages the United States to continue down the path it's continuing. But just as in the United States, both sides of politics are in pretty close agreement on how to deal with China. The same is true in Australia, and that makes me very pessimistic about the prospects for a significant change in direction.
So is the Australian national debate very much also dominated by this very, very, very Western thing to do, which is to distinguish between good and evil and us against them. It's always a dichotomy. And as soon as you say that maybe China is not that big a threat, people will accuse you of being a pro-China, pro-Putin, pro-Xi Jinping lover and stuff like that. Is it the same mindset at the moment?
There is a fair bit of that, yes. I think the tendency of there is a little bit of what you might call a Cold War atmosphere about this, that you're, that if one doesn't support the policy of supporting the United States, then one's somehow being disloyal to the country. And I think it's also, there's a degree of political cowardice about it. People are reluctant to take on the debate. There's also a degree of inexperience. Australia is a lucky country. We have been very secure for a long time because America has dominated East Asia for so long and made the region safe for us. And so Australians aren't very experienced at debating these issues. We were more experienced in the 1920s and 30s and 40s when we through those decades particularly, both before and after the First World War, we were very conscious of what we saw as a rising threat from Japan. We were very conscious of Britain's growing weakness. And so we had quite a, I wouldn't say sophisticated, but at least quite a lively debate about how Australia should frame its future. Particularly after the end of the Cold War, it just seemed as though it was all so easy. America dominated the world, it dominated East Asia, nobody could possibly challenge it, therefore there was nothing for us to worry about. So we have a whole generation of political leaders and policy analysts and journalists and commentators for whom these issues have never really loomed very large. And then when they suddenly did start looming large, and one can be quite precise, it was 2017 that Australians swapped from being very complacent about China to being very alarmist about China, and it sort of, turned on a dime, as our American friends would say. And from then on, it moved very much into the kind of debate that you've described, highly polarized and very sort of values driven and very hostile to genuine dissent.
That's too bad. That's too bad, because that's not a way to get an informed approach going.
Not a way to get a good policy going. So what does the future hold? Well, I think my own view is that although the United States talks a lot about seriously confronting China, it's actually doing very little. It's allowing its position vis-a-vis China to weaken very sharply. You can tell this because when American political leaders talk about what they're doing in response to China, the first thing they mention is AUKUS. And I'll tell you, AUKUS is nothing. I mean, AUKUS is the vague idea that Australia might conceivably operate some nuclear-powered submarines 20 years from now. That's not how you confront a country as powerful as China. And so, I think it's all talk and no action. And this is going to seem a very perverse thing to say, but, I think what Australia needs from Washington is Washington to recognise the reality, that is, that it's not prepared to bear the costs and risks of confronting a rival as powerful as China over the decades to come, and that it accepts that it can't, it therefore contest China's challenge, and therefore, in effect, steps back from East Asia and the Western Pacific. Now, it would be much better for us if America found a way to stay in Asia, to balance China, but without exercising primacy. And long ago, 2012, I published a book in which I argued that that's exactly what China should do, what America should do. I think there's very little chance of America doing that. I think for America, it's either primacy or nothing. And so I think the most likely outcome is that the United States will, one way or the other, gradually step back from Asia and let it go. And I think the election of Donald Trump makes that a more likely outcome. I take Trump's isolationism quite seriously. But the risk, of course, is that before that happens, halfway through the process, a crisis erupts over something like Taiwan, in which the US political leadership doesn't have the courage not to go to war. And then we're in a world of hurt. You wouldn't want to be in Tokyo that week.
The most important thing speaking as a Swiss and from the Swiss experience, is to avoid war. Switzerland didn't get rich just because it's particularly endowed with all of these natural resources, but it avoided 2 world wars, which really gives you a good head start, a very good head start.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
So, Hugh, this was a wonderful overview of Australia's security thinking at the moment. Very, very cogent and very, very concise. Thank you very much for that. Do you publish anywhere in case people want to read more from you? Where should they go?
Yes. Well, I don't publish as much as I used to. I have a series of essays in an Australian series called Quarterly Essays, which have come out over the last few years, 3 essays, and I have a new quarterly essay. We haven't had the title worked out yet, coming out in June this year, which will explore these issues from Australia's perspective at some length. It'll be about 30,000 words long, so a short book, really.
Okay, so if you could send me that link, I will put it into the description of this video.
I will do that.
Professor Hugh White, thank you very much for your time today.
Pascal, my great pleasure. I've enjoyed our conversation.
偷偷告诉大家，我最近发现了新法宝 Royal Face 逆时奇迹系列，它有活肤露、全效精华，还有精华霜。尤其我皮肤比较偏干，所以我非常的注重保湿。保湿做得好，肌肤自然烹润。提亮肤色更年轻，抚平皱纹超有感，而且气色变好。用心保养，每天都更美一点。美吧。